Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, today, folks, in today's edition of the GSMC Car Podcast, we are going to be discussing a forgotten group of automobiles. A forgotten group of automobiles that does not get enough attention from the classic American car scene, the classic luxury American car scene, people who are Buick enthusiasts. I mean, these are cars that just simply really aren't mentioned. And I was noticing about that when one of these cars just popped up into my mind, yesterday or so. I'm like, I wonder why people don't talk about these cars. And then I decided to do some research, and I decided to do a whole podcast dedicated to this forgotten group of automobiles. So let's get started. Today we are going to be discussing the forgotten Buick convertibles. Yes, that's right. Buick made convertibles. Of course, there was a time that all car manufacturers, if they had been long enough, all of their cars were convertibles before closed-bodied cars became, common. I'm talking about after closed-bodied cars became common, and after the convertible sedan had fallen out of favor. These were convertibles made by Buick that didn't really sell well, that don't really have a presence in the enthusiast scene, and that just really nobody cares about. So here they are. You got the Buick Centurion, you've got the Buick Riata, and the Buick Cascada. And then in segment 4, we're going to be discussing my thoughts on the entirety of these situations. What went wrong, what could have been done better, what went well, and basically how these cookies crumbled. So let's get started with the Buick Centurion, which was the first of these. Buick, I want to preface this by saying Buick had not always been a boring automaker. Buick has actually had some pretty fun cars over the years. The Buick Regal GNX, or the Buick Grand National from the 1980s, the last true muscle car, if I could put it that way. The Buick Riata was a fun little car. The Buick Riviera that was discontinued in 1999 was also a fun car. I believe that came optioned with a supercharger on the Series 2 3800 engine that produced 240 horsepower, which was a decent amount for such a small car at the time period. Another car, Buick Regal GS, was a fun car. If we're going to go back before that, I mean, there were quite a bit of interesting, fun, little quirky cars from Buick that Cadillac really never got around to making. Cadillac's, I guess, the most fun car that Cadillac ever made was probably, the Cadillac XLR, save for, the V stuff these days. But before the V thing started taking over, the Cadillac XLR, which was built on a Corvette platform, that only lasted for one generation, however. Let's see, you had the Cadillac Eldorado. But the Cadillac Eldorado, after it really hit its peak in the 1960s, the late 1960s, with a really nice Eldorado. After that, the Eldorado became really large, bloated, and super luxurious, but it's not a fun sporty car. It was more of a grand touring car, but even then, it was too expensive for most people to afford it. And frankly, it was just unwieldy and suffered from excess, if I could put it that way. It began to get sportier in the 80s, and then into the 90s, but it was never officially offered as a convertible after the 80s, and it eventually died in 2002, which it was little more than just a coupe version of the Cadillac Seville. So, like, the Cadillac Eldorado doesn't have a track record, or Cadillac in general doesn't have a track record with making fun cars like Buick before the modern era of 2015 onward, if I could put it that way. So let's get started on the Buick Centurion. The Buick Centurion was a short-lived convertible. You'll find that all of these Buick convertibles were short-lived. Nobody really cared much about them. They didn't really sell well. It was built from 1971 to 1973. Well, even though my research did not specifically mention this as a cause of death for the Buick Centurion, but you all know I've mentioned several times what was going on in the early 70s in the car community, in the car history, if I may put it that way. The oil crisis. This car was a full-size car. It was basically a convertible version of the LeSabre. The LeSabre did have a convertible version, but this was less luxurious, if I could put it that way. The LeSabre was higher up the model line, just below the Electra, which was the full-size Buick before the Roadmaster came through again in the 1990s. So this was basically your sporty Buick, if I could put it that way. But how sporty could something like this possibly get? I mean, yes, it had a giant engine, like something like 5.7 or 7.5 liters. I think there was a 7.5 liter V8 and a 5.7 liter V8. And I think the most power it ever produced, net horsepower, not gross horsepower, net horsepower being 250 net horsepower, which granted is the most powerful of these Buick convertibles, considering that the Riata had less than 200 horsepower, and so did the Cascada. So yeah, it was the most powerful of these Buick convertibles, but it wasn't really that interesting. It wasn't that distinguished from the LeSabre, if I could put it that way. The only way it really differed was in the grille looked a little different and the badging was different. Because what Buick decided to do with the Centurion was actually very interesting. Instead of putting a regular Buick tri-shield on it, like the regular Buick emblem is, they instead opted to put a side profile of a Roman centurion, hence the name Centurion. The name Centurion was actually inspired by the 1956 GM concept car, the Buick, called the Buick Centurion, and it was a sporty, futuristic, bubble-top convertible. It looked straight out of the Jetsons, frankly, and it was absolutely gorgeous. Never actually went into production, but, these concept cars are meant to introduce new technology, are meant to, show off a brand, if you will. They're not actually meant to be produced. You will find that, another concept car that I'll mention later into the podcast never actually went into production either. So, yeah, that's basically what the Buick Centurion was. It was just a convertible LeSabre that was slightly less luxurious. I mean, that about sums it up. The Buick Centurion, I believe it had potential, but gas crisis. These cars back then were terribly, terribly inefficient when it came to fuel consumption. I mean, these cars would shamelessly get 10 miles to the gallon. 10 miles to the gallon, maybe if you had, maybe you might have had a 25-gallon tank because these cars were really big back then. 10 miles to the gallon, 25-mile tank. I mean, that's 250 miles of range, give or take, not including highway driving. Maybe you might get to stretch to 300 a highway drive. There are electric vehicles that have more range than that nowadays. I mean, these cars are terribly impractical when it came to fuel consumption. So that could have been the reason why. What I speculate, maybe the reason why Buick killed the Centurion, on top of poor sales, obviously, because it wasn't that interesting of a car, but it could have been because they didn't need such a large car to add to the lineup. They didn't need it. They already had the Electra, they already had the LeSabre, and they had the Wildcat that was changed to the Century. So all of these things that they didn't need another car costing more to produce in a unique style, only for it to be just as bad as on fuel. People weren't going to be buying a two-door convertible coupe, Buick. That if you're going to buy something, you're going to buy something that's practical, something that is useful, something that is interesting to you, not another two-door convertible when the LeSabre already had one at the same time period. I think the LeSabre stopped producing their convertible in 1972, but by that time, the Centurion was already in its second year. The Centurion was just not special enough. And, that's kind of disappointing. Because if you're going to get a Buick and you're going to get something special to the point where they're going to change the badge and call it the Centurion, at least what they should have done was make the Centurion into a line of, maybe Grand Touring cars, a line of Grand Touring cars that was special, that was interesting, instead of just leaving that one attempt right there and never reproducing it again. It's kind of like how Corvette is like a sub-brand of Chevy. This is terribly wishful thinking. I knew this would actually never happen because GM never makes really good decisions, but what they could have done, they could have had the Centurion as a sub-brand of Buick. So this would have been like Continental for Lincoln, because Cadillac didn't have that. Cadillac was concerned with creating very large, very plushy, super luxurious automobiles at the time. There wasn't really an attainable Grand Touring car for the American market, at least from GM. Think of it. The Lincolns had the Mark series, still going strong at this time. Cadillac had the Eldorado, but Cadillac Eldorados were so expensive. And then again, goodness, a Grand Touring car has to be slightly sporty. The Cadillac Eldorado wasn't sporty by any stretch of the imagination, especially when it hit its peak obesity, if I could put it that way, in the 70s. I love Cadillac, but man, the Eldorado of this time period was just too big. It was, no. A coupe never needs to be that big. What Buick could have done, they could have had like a European-inspired Grand Touring car that, could have taken on the Lincoln Marks of the time period. Even though the Lincoln Marks of the time period hadn't been sporty vehicles, but they were sportier than what Buick was currently offering. And so Buick could have, gone after the Lincoln Marks and done something. I knew there was the Mercury Marauder of the time period, that probably a similar car with a similar result from Ford. Just a large two-door coupe that really nobody wanted. There's a lot of things that Buick could have done to save the Centurion name. They could have had the Centurion that was the first generation. Then they came out with a second generation. All of the Buicks afterward could have been named Centurion if they were sporty models. But it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen because Buick, it's like they dipped their toe into the sporty car scene and then decided that they didn't want to do it anymore. After the Centurion was discontinued, Buick wouldn't see another convertible until 1982 or something like that with the Riviera. And the reason why I don't even mention the Riviera on this list is because the Riviera is not forgotten. The Riviera is alive and well in people's memories because of the amazing cars that Buick, badged under the Riviera name. Nobody who knows anything, who's worth their salt when it comes to American car history, is going to forget the Buick Riviera, especially the Riviera of the late 60s. One of the most beautiful cars ever made, especially one of the most beautiful American cars ever made. So people are not going to forget the Riviera. So yeah, the Riviera had a generation that was a convertible back in the 80s, but we don't need to mention that because the podcast is about forgotten Buick convertibles. The Buick Riviera convertible is not forgotten. So basically, there wasn't anything really special about the Centurion, which kind of makes me sad because they had a lot of potential. They could have done something with it. They chose not to, and such is the case. Buick Centurion goes down as merely a jot in the history of Buick, and people probably won't look back on it. The only reason why I even know about this car is not because I ever saw pictures of it on the internet or heard it on any Facebook groups. I saw it at a small, car, I don't even call it a full-blown car show, a little car get-together that happened right across the street from my neighborhood next to a mechanic shop back in I don't know. This could have been 2015 or something like that. My friend Grant took me. And then I saw a 1973 Buick Centurion there. That was the only time I had ever seen one. I had never seen a Buick Centurion again after that. That was the only time I even knew these cars existed. And it was nice. It wasn't that special. It was a nice classic convertible. But as far as, oh my gosh, this is a Buick Centurion, no, nobody was really freaking out or gathering around it because, it wasn't that special, man. I mean, granted, it should be more special because they barely sold any of them, but I mean, it just isn't that special. And if it does get special, it's not there yet. So, there it is. I mean, please stay tuned for the next segment in which I talk about the Buick Riata, which you all will find is a lot more successful than the Centurion. So please stay tuned.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, car folks. So in the last segment, we discussed the Buick Centurion and basically how it was just a flop. Nobody really purchased it. Nobody really cared much about it. And therefore, it just goes down as a small figment of our memories when it comes to the long and illustrious past of the Buick Motor Corporation. So here we have the Buick Riata. The Buick Riata was made from 1988 to 1991, but the convertible was only made from 1990 to 1991. So here's the deal about the Buick Riata. It was the first Buick convertible on the list that was front-wheel drive. Not that to say that was terribly important, but I wanted to make sure that you all notice a clear shift in Buick's pattern. Buick, for the longest while, like all American cars, were making, or Buick was making, I should say, that's proper grammar. Buick was making body-on-frame rear-wheel drive cars. This was one of the first cars to make that transition from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive. The Riata was exclusively front-wheel drive. There wasn't a generation before this that was rear-wheel drive, and there didn't come a generation after. So the Riata was front-wheel drive, and this was the trend. That continues to this very day when it comes to Buick automobiles. Buick automobiles, except the Roadmaster of the time period, and I believe the Electra had already switched to front-wheel drive at this point, except the Roadmaster, which was the last rear-wheel drive B-body platform holdout that ended in 1996, which, by the way, the Centurion was also a B-body car. But anyway, back to what I was saying. The Riata, was indicative of the times when it comes to front-wheel drive cars. All Buicks after the Roadmaster would be front-wheel drive by default, except in the era of the modern Buicks, which really are all rebadged Opels from Europe, but you'll get to that when I mention the Cascada, that offered all-wheel drive. So yes, the Buick Riata. The Buick Riata was very ahead of its time. Doug DeMuro actually did a review on one of these. It offered a touchscreen control panel for the first 2 model years. We're talking about touchscreens in the 1980s. Granted, are these the super slick infotainment systems of today? Absolutely not. But the fact is that Buick actually had a touchscreen in its car. And I may be wrong, but I believe this is the first American car to ever include a touchscreen. This might be one of the first cars to include a touchscreen. The only reason why I'm not definitely saying that is because I know the Aston Martin Lagonda from a similar time period, I believe had a touchscreen in it as well. And the only reason why I know that is because I watched Doug DeMuro's review of the Aston Martin Lagonda not too very long ago, probably about a year ago. And I remember something about a touchscreen in it. But here we have the Buick. Not even Cadillac had a touchscreen. Buick had a touchscreen, which always struck me as odd because a lot of times GM saved the cool experimental cars for their lesser luxury brands like Buick and Oldsmobile. Cadillac didn't really get any cool experimental things after the 1950s. I mean, into the 60s, Cadillac may have had some cool things, but like all of the cool things from the 50s onward were basically tried out in Oldsmobile and Buick if they ever made it to Cadillac before they were put into Cadillac, which I find super interesting. But yeah, the Riata was very ahead of its time. Had some other features as well, but basically the touchscreen was the crowning achievement of the time period. It had the touchscreen from 88 to 89, and then in 90 onward to 91, they didn't have the touchscreen anymore. Too expensive to produce. I would imagine there were reliability concerns with something like that, even though the one that Doug DeMuro reviewed, the touchscreen still worked perfectly. But, I mean, it's one of those things that, I mean, it was more so of a gimmick than anything. It was a lot easier to just put regular controls than to put a touchscreen in there. But I think GM was trying to prove that they could do it, and by gosh darn it goodness, they did it. So, yeah, there you have it. I mean, that was one of the most, amazing features that any Buick had ever had, especially at that time period, was a touchscreen. At the time of its debut, Buick joined all the other GM marques in having a sporty coupe. Chevy had the Corvette, Pontiac had the Fiero and the Firebird, Cadillac had the Elante, Oldsmobile had the Toronado, and of course, Buick had the Riata and the Riviera. So it was a great time for GM. I just want to mention that for a bit. It was a great time for GM when it came to sporty cars, to sporty coupes. And I believe these sporty coupes would be the beginning of the end when it came to this model of car, when it came to this style of car, as far as American tastes go. Because if you look at it, Corvette obviously is still alive and well. The Fiero died, and that was my last podcast before this one, in which I talked about the Pontiac Fiero. The Pontiac Fiero died in 1988. The Firebird continued until Pontiac died. Oh, no, wait. The Firebird continued, I believe, until the early 2000s when the Catfish Camaro died. It also died because they were the same car, essentially, the Chevy Camaro and the Pontiac Firebird. So the Pontiac Firebird probably died in like 2002 or something. Cadillac's Elante died in 92. And the Toronado, I really don't know anything about Oldsmobile besides the Aurora. So I don't know when the Toronado died. But the point is, the Toronado's dead, and Oldsmobile's been dead for the past 16 years. So, I mean, it was the beginning of the end for these sorts of things. People weren't interested in large luxury coupes anymore. People weren't interested in these sort of cars. Granted, the Riata wasn't very large, but they weren't interested in sort of these sorts of cars of this time period. The Riata was meant to be Buick's halo car, a car meant to show off the brand's innovations and attract people to buying Buick cars. So I guess the idea was someone would walk into a Buick dealership, see a Riata, sitting on the showroom floor and be attracted to either buying said Riata or buying another Buick because they know that Buick also makes Riata. He didn't really achieve that. It wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. The convertible would be the last of the convertibles until the Cascada debuted in 2016, which was 25 years later after the demise of the Riviera, not the Riviera, the Riata in 91. They wanted to make 20,000 Riatas every year for a production run of 80,000 at the end of 4 years if they had decided from the very beginning to stop it at 4 years. But at the end of 4 years, in reality, they had just 21,000 units made. So, like I said, much like the Centurion, the Riata didn't sell well. I can't really tell the reason why the Riata didn't sell well, however. Maybe because it wasn't sporty enough. I mean, it was front-wheel drive with a V6. So that could have been the reason why. It could have been rear-wheel drive, and maybe it would have sold more. But then again, it risked competition with things like the Corvette and the Firebird. So maybe it shouldn't have been rear-wheel drive. I don't know, to tell you the truth. I don't know why the Riata didn't sell extremely well. I will say, however, of the three convertibles, it was the best convertible all around, but you'll find out more about my thoughts in segment 4 concerning that. The Riata just wasn't that special. I mean, it's kind of sad. That the Riata had all of these innovations, and then they decided to take out said innovations in order to make the car, I guess, easier to produce or something like that. You don't make Halo cars because they're easy to produce. You make Halo cars so you can attract buyers to the brand, and so you can get, so you can revitalize the brand a bit. Because, frankly, Buick has always been in need of revitalization. Because Buick has always been seen as the old people's car. You weren't rich enough to buy a Cadillac, or the Cadillac was too ostentatious for you, so you got a Buick. That's what Buick has been since Cadillac was invented, and since they, merged under the GM partnership. Buick, obviously, was never really seen by the public as a young people's car, exciting brand offering new innovation or anything of that sort. And I think that's what really plagued the Riata. The fact that maybe the people that they wanted to buy it didn't actually end up buying it. Because when you think of it, who wants a front-wheel drive convertible? The people who are going to be buying a sports car don't want it to be front-wheel drive. They don't. They want it to be rear-wheel drive. They want to be able to do burnouts. They want to be able to do that sort of thing. And the Riata wasn't able to do that sort of thing. Unless you probably heavily modified it. And I don't think anybody did that. Because, it was just your sleepy convertible. Your sleepy convertible. If you wanted an exciting car, you got a Corvette or you got a Firebird if you couldn't, afford a Corvette. You could have gotten a Fiero, but like you found out in the last segment, the Fiero wasn't that great. I mean, it didn't live up to the hype that it generated back in 1984 when it had first come out. It didn't live up to that hype. So by the time, even though the 88 model was really nice and but anyways, I digress. If you wanted an exciting car, you didn't go to Buick. So it was cute of Buick to think that they would be able to attract people to their brand by creating sort of a faux sporty little car. I mean, if you really want a sporty car to do sporty things with, you could have front-wheel drive, but that's not what you should have. You should have a rear-wheel drive. That way, it can actually handle like a sports car, not just a downsized boat, which I've never driven a Riata, probably will never drive a Riata because they're becoming rare these days. The newest Riata is 6 years older than I am, so that's just to put it into perspective. I'm not going to find a car to drive. But I can imagine it just handled like a downsized boat. Front-wheel drive, lazy V6 engine. It didn't offer much as far as performance goes. And that could have really been the nail in the coffin for the Riata. The Riata could have been something great. The Riata could have been like, the Pontiac Solstice before there was a Pontiac Solstice. It could have been the Saturn Sky before there was a Saturn Sky. But nope, they decided to just leave it, I don't even know, just leave it uninteresting. Leave it uninteresting. They offered a convertible for the last 2 years and called it a day. I mean, did GM think they were going to be able to get away with that? Maybe they did. But they soon found out that they weren't going to be able to. So, I mean, the Riata didn't offer much in terms of enticing people to buy a Buick. I know one would never tend to hear enticing and Buick in the same sentence, but here you have it. Here on the GSMC podcast, you can hear enticing and Buick in the same sentence. There you are. You're welcome for that thought. But yeah, the Riata, like I said, was probably the most successful of the three convertibles that Buick offered over the years, but definitely not successful, relatively speaking, to other car brands. So please stay tuned for the next segment in which I'm going to be talking about the Cascada. Now, if you all thought the Centurion was boring, if you all thought the Riata was boring, boy, wait till you hear about the Cascada. But please stay tuned after the commercial break for you to hear about how boring the Cascada actually is, and only to find out that it's actually not a real Buick. So please stay tuned for the next segment.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So we have the Buick Cascada in this segment 3 of the GSMC Car Podcast about the forgotten Buick convertibles. In the first segment, we discussed the Centurion. Second segment, we discussed the Riata, which was basically the most successful of all of these cars that we are mentioning on this podcast. And we have the Cascada. First off, just like I had teased you all at the end of the last segment, the Cascada is not a real Buick. First off, it was a rebadged Opel from Germany. And they called it the Opel Cascada over in Germany. Just like the Buick Regal of the same time period. The Buick Regal was a rebadged Opel Insignia, I believe. Something like that. It's not a Buick. It's an Opel. And not only was it an Opel, it was also an Opel Cabrio in Spain. It was a Vauxhall Cascada in the UK. It was a Holden Cascada in Australia. The only places it was known as a Buick Cascada were in China and the United States. And it was produced from 2016 to 2019. Now, I'm going to have to stretch when it comes to this segment, goodness, because there really isn't much to say about the Buick Cascada. Of course, if I'm talking about forgotten, failed convertibles of Buick's past, I had to mention the Cascada. But there really wasn't anything much about it. It wasn't special. I mean, the Riata was miles more special than this. And the Riata itself wasn't really that special. So it was powered by a 197 horsepower turbo V or turbo 4-cylinder engine. Yeah, that was the only engine available. Obviously, front-wheel drive. It was just another failed attempt at making Buick appear to younger buyers. The Cascada was beautiful, but it was unveiled during a time that nobody was buying sport luxury coupes. The luxury coupe segment pretty much died with the demise of the Riviera, especially with American cars. That's basically what I wrote word for word in my notes. Now let me elaborate on that. Why did GM think it was a good idea to bring a rebadged Opel from Germany, slap it on the American car scene, and then pretend that nobody would notice and everybody would just flock to it? Young people would come to buy it from Buick, and, every day it'd be in a day's work that everything would be fine and dandy, hunky-dory afterward. Why? I mean, think of it. If they had done this just a few years earlier, during the time where the Pontiac Solstice was Pontiac's last breath of relevance, or they had done it for the Saturn Sky, which was Saturn's last breath of relevance, they could have had the Buick Cascada then. Think of it. It could have been a trifecta. You could have had the Grand Tourer version of these cars, which could have been the Buick Cascada. You could have had the sportier car, which would have been the Pontiac Solstice. And then you could have had, the cheaper version, which could have been the Saturn Sky. There could have been a way to do this properly. They chose not to. They waited too long to bring out the Cascada. By the time the Cascada had been unveiled, nobody was into luxury coupes in the United States anymore. I mean, the only luxury coupes people were really buying were the ones from Germany, like from BMW and Mercedes-Benz, which somehow they've been able to still be successful in offering those, which I have no clue. I'm going to have to do some research into that, because how are they able to stay so successful in the coupe market and the wagon market and the sedan market, where American luxury cars are floundering in all of those? So I don't know. Maybe the Germans are doing some sort of voodoo over there that are making people want to buy their cars. But anyway, I digress. The Cascada was a flop. I mean, I'm not going to even sugarcoat it. The Cascada was just a plain old flop. The Centurion was a cool idea. The Riata was really ahead of its time and really brought something to Buick. And I'm not sure why it failed. Maybe because it was front-wheel drive and it wasn't very fun to drive and it wasn't really that special as far as performance goes. Maybe that's why the Riata failed. The Cascada failed for an obvious reason. There wasn't a market for it. It didn't need to come. Cadillac wasn't offering any coupes at the time period. Maybe the ATS coupe and the CTS coupe, which were not convertibles and which were aimed at combating, the German cars that Cadillac has been so obsessed with. But why? Why does the Buick Cascada even exist? It's a terrible idea. I'm not saying it was a terrible car. Frankly, there's not enough of them for you to even get any reliability ratings on something like that. I've seen maybe 3. And this is the only car on this list that was produced and discontinued within my lifetime. I was in high school when this thing came out. In fact, it was senior year of high school, maybe freshman year of college, that the Buick Cascada came out. I remember when it came out. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I thought it was cool. But then again, one thing y'all have to remember, I am not your average car consumer in the United States. I tend to like the cars that nobody else likes. I don't care for crossovers. I like sedans. Everybody is gawking over crossovers. Nobody's gawking over sedans. Thus why Buick is no longer making sedans anymore. And so many other car companies have axed their sedans from their lineups. So I am not a good measure for what are the car tastes of the world. I thought the Cascada was great. I thought it looked cool. I thought it was sporty. And I could totally see, someone doing something with it if they took enough interest. But nobody took enough interest in the Cascada for them to do anything with it. It came at a time where nobody was buying luxury coupes from American cars. Think of it. The Eldorado, which was a traditional American luxury coupe, died 14 years earlier. Buick killed their own Riviera 17 years before the Cascada came out. Oldsmobile was dead. Saturn was dead. Pontiac was dead. Ford didn't have a coupe anymore. They killed their Mark series after the Mark 8 ended, I believe, in the early 2000s. They weren't offering a coupe. Mercury at this time period had been dead for 5 years. So no American car company off the top of my head was offering traditional American luxury coupes, was offering sporty coupes, was offering any sort of coupe besides Cadillac. And Cadillac had a clear reason to be doing that because they were combating the Germans. Buick Cascada was not trying to combat anybody. They were just trying to revitalize their brand, in which if you're going to do that with something that people are actually interested in buying. What a great idea. If you're going to revitalize something, why revitalize something with something as insipid as a 197 horsepower excuse for a sports car from Germany? That's not even a German car company that's producing it. It's an American car company that happens to be producing cars in Germany under their Opel mark. So you're going to take a rebadged Opel from Europe, and then you're going to call it a day, and you're going to be like, look, this is it. This is the Buick Cascada. And that's it. There ain't nothing more to it. It is what you see, and it is what it is. You get what you see. You get what you get, and you don't pick a fit. I mean, that's it. There was nothing more to the Cascada besides the fact that Buick wanted to revitalize its brand again. And I will never understand. I will say with great confidence, I will never understand. I can never understand. I don't think I will be able to understand why Buick brought out the Cascada in the first place. I liked it, but don't do it off of what David Lucy Mabel likes. Do it off of what, people actually want in the car community. So, I mean, that was the Cascada. Just a failed attempt. Failed attempt at something. I don't know what the attempt really was. I don't know what they were trying to do, but it was a failed attempt. It was a failed car. Lackluster sales, lackluster performance. It's front wheel drive. Buick is already seen as old people's cars anyway. And Buick had already come out with some interesting automobiles during that time period. The Buick Regal was awesome. The Buick Regal had a Buick Regal Tour X, I believe, that came out a year after the Cascada. The Buick Regal had, a fastback model. It had all sorts of... Buick Regal was doing real well for Buick. I mean, the Buick LaCrosse had an Avenir trim. I mean, Buick was doing real well. And then they decided to, throw their eggs into the Cascada basket. For what reason, I have no clue. Yeah. It should have been obvious from the start that the Buick Cascada was going to be a flop. I must have an honorable mention. Now that I'm done discussing the actual Buick convertibles, I have to have an honorable mention for the Buick Bengal concept that came out in 2001, I believe. It was a roadster by Buick that was supposed to have voice-activated technology, so voice controls. And they said that there could have been up to 100 different voice commands that that the Bengal would react to. And that's what I thought was super cool. I remember my first experience with the Buick Bengal was a toy car that a family friend of ours, who basically is like my great aunt, we grew up knowing her and her husband, and they've been my dad's closest family friends for the past 30 years. I mean, we know these people very, very well. And she gave us my brother and I some toy cars. And one of the toy cars that she gave me was a light blue Buick Bengal. And I remember thinking it was so pretty. It was so awesome. That was my first experience with a Buick Bengal. And obviously it was based off of a real car. So as I got older, I did research on the real car, and it always stuck in my mind. And now I decided to, mention it in the podcast. And see and give it as an honorable mention. It was supposed to be put into production, actually, but it never went into production. It was axed. It was discontinued before it was ever put into production. They were saving their, they were saving their resources to produce something that they thought was a bit more realistic, which was the Buick Velite concept that came out, I believe, in 2007 or 2008. That was actually built on the same platform as the Pontiac Solstice and the Saturn Sky. So maybe if I had said this earlier, maybe GM would have caught wind of what I was saying and maybe would have actually put the Velite into production. But the Velite was basically a more realistic version of a Buick convertible that could have been offered, and it was supposed to be another halo car for Buick. It lent its styling to Buicks of the era. If you look at it, it has a lot of design cues that are common on Buicks of that time period that eventually evolved into the Buick design language that we have today. But yeah, that was the Buick Velite concept, and that was the Buick Bengal concept. What I think that GM really did wrong was the fact that they should have put the Bengal into production. Even if it was a limited production car, man, would people have flocked to Buick if you could have a voice-controlled car. Like, the technology was there to do it. The technology was there. If they could put it in a concept car, they could put it into production. The technology was there. The resources, maybe the resources weren't there. But in a perfect world, the resources would have been there. So in that case, what was so difficult for GM to do? They could have just put it into production, and they could have just removed it if it didn't sell well. But I guarantee this would have sold more than the Riata. It would have sold more than the Cascada that would come 15 years later, and it would have sold more than the Centurion of the 70s. But they decided not to take the risk and not go for it. And does Buick regret that decision? I highly doubt it, but I regret it for them. Because the Buick Bengal would have been an awesome car. And you know what? The Buick Bengal could have been a great competitor to the Thunderbird of the time period. And maybe, in a perfect world, if the Thunderbird actually had a competitor in a market segment, then maybe they could have extended the life of the Thunderbird because there was actually a car worth fighting against, which would have been the Buick Bengal. So get this. You have the Buick Bengal and you have the Ford Thunderbird. One's retro personal luxury coupe convertible. Another one is more futuristic personal luxury coupe convertible. And then this could have prompted Ford to continue with the Thunderbird. This could have prompted Buick to continue with the Bengal to just combat the Thunderbird. And it could have been like a new front in the battle of Ford versus GM when it came to the Thunderbird, because the Thunderbird was first slotted against the Corvette, then the Corvette went more sporty, Thunderbird went more luxurious, then the Thunderbird was like slotted against the Monte Carlo, which the Monte Carlo didn't really ever truly take a chunk out of Thunderbird's profits, and then you could have had Thunderbird versus Buick Bengal. It could have worked. It didn't, though. They didn't have that much foresight, and I guess, money makes the car world go round, and money probably just they weren't willing to allocate money towards the project, which at the end of the day, I really don't blame them, because that's a shot in the dark. That's just me really desperately missing the Thunderbird and wishing that they didn't discontinue it. So maybe if they had something to fight against, they would have, but wishful thinking on my part. So, yeah, that was the Buick Cascada and the Buick Bengal and the Buick Velite concepts. Yeah, That was it. They weren't that interesting. At least the Cascada wasn't. The Philly and the Bengal concepts would have been interesting if they went into production. So that's unfortunate. So please stay tuned for the next segment of the podcast in which I tell you my thoughts on these cars. And I'm going to go more in depth in the reason why I think of these in the first place. So please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, welcome back, car folks. So in the first segment, we discussed the Centurion. Second segment, we discussed the Riata. Third segment, we discussed the Cascada and the two convertible Buick concept cars that they had. Now let's dive in. What are my thoughts on these vehicles? And what was the vision I had for them? Because the reason why I did this podcast is because I was struggling for an idea, not gonna lie. I was struggling for an idea of what I needed to do for this podcast. Because typically I would have done, some things, but these days I've just been busy. I've been busy with school, with work, with other sorts of things going on in my life. So I was like, I had not really thought much ahead into what I was going to do until I was inspired by something or rather. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do a podcast on a Buick Centurion. But then I realized that the Buick Centurion, there was not enough information on it to justify an hour podcast on just the Centurion. And then I noticed a trend. I was like, well, if not just the Centurion, I could do it on all the Buick convertibles, because this is not something that people think about. People don't think about Buick offering convertibles. You go to any layman person on the street, and you're going to say, what does Buick offer? Old people cars. Is a convertible an old people car? Not really, unless you're talking about a Corvette, in which it's an old rich guy driving it. Buick does not offer convertibles, per the reasoning of the American public. They actually did offer convertibles, but people don't actually know about that. So I decided to do a podcast on it, and why exactly these Buick convertibles failed. Here's the deal. GM, I'm not going to say they chose the wrong company to market these convertibles under, but they chose the wrong company to market these convertibles under. The reason why I didn't want to say that is because I'm a fan of Buick. As you all know, I drive a Buick. I love my Buick. I think Buick is better than Cadillac, frankly, as far as reliability goes, at least. But when something new and exciting is going to appear, you kind of have to offer it in a new and exciting brand. And what is GM's new and exciting brand right now? Even though it's not new, but it's exciting, it's Cadillac. It's Cadillac. Cadillac is the exciting brand. Cadillac has the V models. Cadillac still has sedans. Cadillac is making headway, and Cadillac is doing really well. They finally figured out what on earth they want to do concerning the German people, or not the German people, the German cars that the German people make. They finally figured out what the heck they want to do, and they're actually doing it. and they figured out that they're going to rival, Lincoln as far as the SUV game goes. I mean, Cadillac has finally got their crap together. So why not offer the Cascada under Cadillac? Because Cadillac didn't have a convertible. They could have offered the Cascada, or at least not the Cascada. They could have offered a convertible Cadillac that would have gone right in with the car scene. I mean, the Germans are still making things like the Audi R8. They're still making things like the Mercedes-Benz SL. They're still making things like, some of the BMW convertibles. If BMW has convertibles, I think they have convertibles. They're still making things like, other sorts of sporty convertible cars. Cadillac could have done that. GM shouldn't have gotten the Opel Cascada from Europe, brought it to the United States, marketed it as a Buick Cascada, and then called it a day for it to only last 3 years and have miserable sales. No. They didn't think it through. Look at what Lexus is offering. Lexus is offering the LC. Does Cadillac have something to combat the LC? Absolutely the heck not. No, they don't. The only car combating the LC right now, even though frankly, like you all heard in my podcast about the Lexus LC is not a car that's going to be successful because people aren't buying those cars. But the thing is, the only reason why people aren't buying them cars is because maybe there's not enough variety in the segment. I mean, I don't know, man. You need to do something. If you want people to buy them, put it out there. Make it enticing enough for people to buy. Obviously, there's some people who buy the Lexus LC because if not, it would have already gone out of production. People buy the Mercedes-Benz SL. Even though the sales are slowing, people still buy them, so they're still producing them. Cadillac could have done something instead of putting it on Buick to do something about the convertible car. Like, I guess GM's idea was people want an affordable sports car. People are not going to go to an American brand for an affordable sports car. If you want that, you're going to go to the Japanese brands. The Japanese were the ones who have mastered the art of producing affordable sports cars. Like, the Nissan Z series, the Mazda Miatas, the Toyota, oh God gracious, what are some Toyotas? Toyota MR2s, Toyota Supras, or Scion FRSs. I mean, those are relatively, affordable cars that are also sporty. That's what, that's what GM thought that they were going to be able to do. Offer a sporty, affordable car. No, that's not what you need to do. What you need to do is forget the affordable luxury, sports coupe or whatever they were trying to do with the Cascada. Forget that. Don't put it under Buick. Put the new convertible under Cadillac and then pitch it at the Lexus LC and the Mercedes-Benz SL. That's what they should have done instead of putting it on Buick. Because frankly, when people are looking for something new and exciting, they don't go towards Buick. It's the fact of the matter. They don't go towards Buick. Buick is not new. Buick is not exciting. Buick is not as boring as they used to be, but Buick is not new. Buick is not exciting. They should have done it. They could have been like the XLR-V or something. I don't know. They could have done something with it. But Cadillac, or not Cadillac, I can't blame Cadillac. GM dropped the ball on this. That's my, perspective on the Cascade. I guess I'm going backwards. My gripe about the Riata, even though it had poor sales, was the most successful of the three convertibles. The best technology of the time period, the most desirable of all of these. But it should have been a better performer. My gripe is the fact that the Riata wasn't rear-wheel drive. It wasn't rear-wheel drive. If you're going to offer something European-esque, if you're going to offer something that is supposed to actually be exciting and generate sales, make it rear-wheel drive, man. Look how awesome the Buick Regal was when it was upgraded to the GNX. Rear-wheel drive, turbo 6-cylinder engine goodness, last true muscle car. Look how awesome, look how great, look how legendary the Buick GNX, the Buick Regal Grand National were. That's all you need to know. That's all Buick should have looked at when it came to offering a sporty two-door car like the Riata. They should have made it rear-wheel drive. The reason why they probably didn't do this is, like I briefly mentioned, maybe they didn't want competition against the Corvette or against the Firebird or the future of the Camaro or anything of that sort. Maybe they didn't want competition. And that's understandable. That's understandable. But at the same time, they could have differentiated the Riata enough and made it a grand touring car. A grand touring car in the sense that it wasn't purely focused on sport. It was more focused on plushy luxury. And then it offered some sport. Kind of like the Cadillac Elante. But the Cadillac Elante, the problem was the Cadillac Elante was exorbitantly expensive. Because the Cadillac Elante, if you all remember when I mentioned the Cadillac Elante, when I was talking about Italian cars, the reason why I mentioned it in that podcast is because the Cadillac Elante's body was made by Pininfarina in Italy and then flown over in a modified Boeing jet plane to the United States only to be assembled with the chassis and then sold. This thing in today's money was over $100,000. This is not something that people can work and live up and save up to in their lifetime. You're either rich or you're not rich if you want the Cadillac Elante. If you weren't rich, you have to wait until probably 20 years later when they depreciated enough for you to buy one. I can buy a Cadillac Elante today. Would I want to? Absolutely not, because they were terribly unreliable. But what Buick could have done with the Riata, Buick could have done a more affordable grand touring car so that Cadillac could focus on really fine-tooth combing the quality of the Elante. And then the more mass market grand touring American car could have come from Buick. That way, they would have been satisfied. They could have had the Elante, and the Elante would have been limited production, and the Elante would have been expensive, but the Elante would have been of very good quality. And GM would have saved a lot more money because they produced so many Elantes and they lost money on each of them because of the whole, ritual of building it in Italy and flying it to the United States. So Buick could have been an affordable grand touring car with the Riata. But they chose to make it front-wheel drive, and they chose to not make it anything interesting as far as performance goes. At least the Elante had with the North Star engine at 270-something horsepower. The Elante could have performed. Granted, the Elante was more of a grand tourer than anything else, but the Elante could have performed if it wanted to. The Buick Riata, on the other hand, not really. Buick Riata was powered by the first generation of the Buick 3800 series engines towards the last 2 years, I believe, and it wasn't that interesting. And on top of that, the convertible version never got the touch screen. So there goes your incentive for buying a convertible if you wanted the best of the best technology and whatnot. Only the hardtop coupe versions of the 1988 and 1989 model years came out with the touch screen. So that was basically my gripe with the Buick Riata. And my gripe with the Centurion, you already pretty much heard it. But Centurion, if they were going to go out on a limb and create a new badge, they should have just run with it. Buick Centurion should have just been called Centurion and should have offered cars that were more luxurious and more special than your regular Buick. Cadillac wasn't doing this, and Cadillac's super expensive Eldorado wasn't really cutting it for the mass market, the average people. They could have done this much like Lincoln did with the Continental Mark series. They could have had the Centurion Mark series, if you will, and then created grand touring cars. But they didn't. So there you have it. I mean, those are basically the Buick convertibles. The failed Buick convertibles. The forgotten Buick convertibles. Do I love every single one of them? Absolutely. Except maybe the Cascada. I mean, I liked the Cascada when it first came out, but now finding out it's just a rebadged Opel, I don't care so much about it. But I love all of them nonetheless. I wish Buick had done a better job. I wish GM had done a better job. There was so much potential in each of these, but you have to understand, sometimes the money just isn't there. Sometimes the money is there, but it needs to be allocated to something else. And sometimes the people who are reading the market just don't deem it a risk worth taking. Because at the end of the day, there is risk and there is reward. A car company can't be all about risk and not calculating the reward from taking the risk too. So I completely understand why these things turned out the way they did. I just wish they hadn't. So this has been the GSMC podcast, a car podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am David Lucy Mabel. Please leave us a like, a review, a comment, a subscribe, something, or rather, tell your friends about us. And thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful night. Goodbye.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.